Hey everyone, this is Michael Thiessen here, and I am so excited to be able to present to you today. This is actually my third time at ViewConf, 3 years in a row, and I am so honored to be back here again. Every year it's been an amazing experience, and although these videos are pre-recorded, I am sure that it's already been an awesome experience and will continue to be great. So before I get started, I want to thank Jilson and the entire team at ViewConf for putting this together and for having me. I've actually kept my lanyards from the previous years because they're just such good memories and I want to remember them. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Michael Thiessen and I write a blog at michaelnthiessen.com where I write all about Vue from beginner topics all the way up to more advanced topics, although I do tend to focus more on intermediate patterns and techniques and advanced ways that you can use Vue to really supercharge your development. If you've spent a bunch of time Googling for questions and trying to find answers to solve your problems through Google, there's a pretty good chance that you've ended up on my blog, whether you remembered it or not. I also create courses to teach you more about Vue. Last year, I released a course called Clean Components, and actually this week, I released a new one called Reusable Components. That's on sale right now. Just a few days ago, it launched. In fact, what I'm going to talk to you today is about reusable components and how we can get more out of our components by building in these patterns of reusability. I'm actually going to give you 2 videos from that course. The first one is on the 6 levels of reusability, which gives an overview of all of the different ways that we can use reusability within our components. The second video will dive deep into understanding what scoped slots are and how they work so that you can actually start to implement them in your own components instead of just using them or sort of knowing them as a feature that you kind of understand but don't really know enough to use. By the end of this talk, you will know how to use scope slots in your own code. Scoped slots are one of the least understood but most powerful features of Vue, in my own opinion. And so I think it's really important to understand how to use them really well. So without further ado, here are the videos. There are 6 different levels of reusability that a component can go through. From beginning to end, they're not necessarily more difficult or better in any way, but they build on top of each other and grow in complexity. And these levels are useful to think about because it helps you to understand where you're at and what type of reusability is necessary for your specific component that you're working with. Not all components need to be crazy flexible or maximally reusable. Sometimes it's just enough to have a component that can be used in a couple places, and that's it. So let's take a look at the 6 different levels of reusability. So the first one is templating. Then we have configuration, adaptability, inversion, extension, and then nesting. So we'll go into a little bit about each one, but ultimately the rest of the course is about diving into each one of these in great detail and really exploring them and getting the most out of them that we possibly can. Now, these first 3, templating, configuration, and adaptability, these are things that you've probably dealt with or at least heard about. These are more common techniques that I see people using. However, the last 3 are things that I have never seen out there in the wild. And so they may very well be the first time that you've ever heard of these things. And so the bulk of this course is actually focused on 4, 5, and 6. But we will cover the first 3 just to make sure we're all on the same page. We've all got the right context going into this. But we won't be spending a lot of time on them. So this first one is templating. It lets us reuse markup across different components, which makes our future changes to these components a lot simpler. So instead of copy and pasting your code everywhere throughout your application, you actually take that bit of code that you want to reuse and wrap it up inside of a component. And instead of copying and pasting, you can just reuse that component throughout your application. Then if you need to change something about that code, you just change in that component in that one spot, and it updates everywhere else across your application. The other benefit that's not as often talked about is that we don't forget about all of the different places that we've copied and pasted. After months or even years go by, you may have copy and pasted that button code dozens of times. And then when you go back in to update the border radius, or you want to add in a loading state or something like that, you forget all the different places that you've copied and pasted. And templating allows you to eliminate that issue. So for example, we could do this with a button component. Instead of copy and pasting the code for the button and its loading state, disabled state, and all the other things that go along with that, we can just take that code, wrap it up in a nice little component, and then reuse that component all throughout our application. This is one of the more common use cases for reusability, the one that you'll often see talked about the most. So let's move on. Number 2 is configuration. So here we're actually taking advantage of props and using them to create variations in the behavior of our component. So instead of copying and pasting different versions of our component for every different kind of thing we need it to do, we're actually going to just use a prop to make those little tweaks and little changes as we need them. Now this is different than changing the state of a component. For example, our button component could have a loading state or a disabled state, but I wouldn't consider that to be part of configuration. The data that's being used in the component is also not part of the configuration. So the text that's on the button, for example, would not be part of that configuration. But if we used a type prop to create a primary and a default button type, or to create a button that just has an icon on it and no text, then that would be an example of configuration. This third one is adaptability. And here we're going to go even further and actually allow the child component to control how the markup from the parent component is used. So this gives us a lot more flexibility than props. With props, we're limited to strings, numbers, booleans, objects, arrays. And instead, here we can pass in, using slots, we can pass in any HTML, any markup that we want. Instead of being limited to those 5 primitive types, we can pass in whatever we want to this child component. So what this does is it actually gives our components adaptability. With props, you have to imagine all of the future use cases for that component, and you have to build them into that component. With adaptability, you are using a slot to give flexibility to the component so that it can be used differently in the future based on whatever needs it has. So a good example of this is if we, instead of using a text prop for the button, we actually use a slot. By using a slot, we can pass in text, but we can also pass in an icon, we can pass in an image, we can pass in a loading spinner if we forgot to add that into our base component and we don't want to go back in and add that. We can add in this loading spinner after the fact. Something that wasn't even thought of when we initially created this component, but because we've given the component adaptability, we can add in that extra use case on the fly. Number 4 is inversion. Here we actually let the child component know how to render our markup. So the difference between adaptability and inversion is that with adaptability, we are giving the markup from the parent to the child as a single chunk. With inversion, we are passing rules or a recipe to the child component. And then the child component will then take that recipe and do whatever it wants with that. So this is like the difference between ordering takeout, where you just get the meal delivered to you, versus looking at a recipe online. When you have the recipe, it's a little bit more work because you have to actually make it, but you can make your own tweaks to it. You can substitute different ingredients if you want. And so inversion gives us more flexibility. It actually unlocks full adaptability within a component. And where adaptability is done using slots, inversion, we typically will use scope slots to let us do this. So a good example of this one is rendering a list of items, but with inversion, we can actually have the parent component tell the child component how each item in that list should be rendered. The parent doesn't have the list of data, and it's not responsible for iterating through that list of data, but it gives it a recipe for how to render that data out. Number 5 is extension. So we take this idea of adaptability and inversion, and now we're going to apply it across the entire component. We're going to extend that behavior of the component in as many different ways as we need to. We'll do that by creating multiple different extension points within our component. So with our list, we can customize how each item is rendered. In this way, we're going to add that, but we can also have other elements of that component customizable. And here we're going to take advantage of named slots so that we can have multiple different slots within our component. For example, we could have a component that has a header and a footer slot. And by adding in multiple extension points like this, we can extend the behavior in not just one way, but multiple different ways. We can override the header slot and extend the behavior of the header in that way, or we can do the footer, or we can do both of these and extend the majority of this component's behavior by extending the header and footer slots at the same time. This last one is the most advanced, the most complex, which is why it's number 6. And it is nesting this idea of extension. So we're going to take this idea of extension points, but we're going to actually pass these extension points through several different layers of components. The reason that we do this is that we often have a hierarchy of components. Each component extends the other component, but adding more specific functionality. Now, this is extremely valuable in large applications. If you're doing something with a very small or maybe even medium-sized application, you may not run into something like this. But if you have components that are being used in many different ways throughout your application, then this will actually be extremely useful. So an example of this is the classic object-oriented subclassing example. If we have an animal, it's the most broad category. But then we can take that animal and add some attributes to it. That it's warm-blooded, and several other things. I'm not a biologist, so I don't know. But then we get to a mammal. And a mammal's pretty broad category still. But if you had a dog component, for example, you could reuse that component several times to implement not just the poodle component, but a Labrador component or a beagle component. And at each of these different levels, you can override them in different ways to create different trees of components that all override each other, extend each other, and leverage reusability to its maximum potential. So those are the 6 different levels of reusability. The rest of this course, we will dive deeper into understanding and fleshing out these different levels and seeing how they work and operate. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of where we're going and will help you to recognize where you're using these different levels within your own code and maybe give you some ideas on how you can apply these already to the projects that you're working on. So now I'd like to take some time to explain how scoped slots work. So earlier we took a look at regular slots and how they work and how you can think of them as functions. And now we'll see exactly why scoped slots are functions and exactly why they are implemented as functions in Vue. So here we have a child component, and inside of that we've got this slot. Now using a scoped slot, we grab this item and we render it using a bold styling. And so that's what you see here. In our child component, we've got before, and then we have our slot where we iterate through these values on this array. And then we get this after printed after the slot. Now this slot, because it's going through each one, will pop each one of those values in turn through this template. And that's why we get 3 of these, all with this font bold class on them. So I'll show you how we can actually replicate this functionality using just functions and some strings. So we'll grab this class so we can make it look exactly the same, and we'll create this div here. So we're going to use this vhtml directive, which lets us take any arbitrary HTML that we want, and we'll actually render it to the DOM as HTML. Normally, if we would put HTML inside of a curly braces like this, it will render it just as text, and we don't want that. So we're going to do this and call a method called createFakeComponent. And so in our setup, we'll just create this method here. And so what this will do is we'll return a div. And for now, we'll just put in before and then after. So we actually need to call that method. There we go. And now we've got this fake component here instead of using this child. In fact, I'm going to move this class off of this div here that does the border, and we're actually going to put this on here instead. But now we actually want to do more than this. We want to be able to do this slot here. So like we saw in the previous lesson, I can actually create a slot in here just by using some interpolation here. So if I have that, then I can say, put this in the slot. And now we see that all we're doing is passing this as a variable into our createFakeComponent method, and it's rendering it out. Slots can be seen to be just arguments passed into a function. And a component is just a function that returns some HTML. But scoped slots, well, those are a little bit different yet. With a scoped slot, we're not just passing in anything, we're passing in a function. And so if we take this child and we say, okay, let's replicate this v4, what we can do is actually put this in place of our regular slot. We'll put in this scoped slot and we'll map it. And for right now, we'll just do nothing with this mapping. And we'll see that it prints out 1, 2, 3. And actually the commas are there because it renders it as an array. So if I do this, then it will print out this string for us. So now we've sort of simulated this v4 that's going on, but that's not a scoped slot at all. We need to be able to, like we do here, pass in this template, which lets us control how each of these items are rendered. So we'll pass in, or we'll change this name to be scoped slot, and we'll actually use that as the function. So now what we need to do is pass in a function that takes an element and returns some sort of HTML. And so instead of this, we'll go element and we'll write class is font bold and then put EL there. And I messed up the formatting because I used double quotes in here instead of single quotes. Tricky little things here. But as you can see, now we've got the exact same output here. And what's going on is that we pass in this function, which is exactly like passing in this scoped slot. And this function takes in an element, and then we use that element to return some HTML. And so that's exactly what this scoped slot is doing. We take in an element, in this case from the v slot, and we use that to generate some HTML, which we return. And in our child component, we're using this slot once for every one of these items in this array. And as you'll see here, we're doing the exact same thing. Once for every time in this array, we're going to call this scoped slot function on this element, which then returns us some HTML. So when we provide a scoped slot like this, what we're really doing is passing a function down to this child component, and then that child component can then call up into the parent component so that it can learn, or that it can figure out how to render each item. The crucial thing here is that this child component calls these things when it wants to. It calls this function when it wants to. It's not controlled by the parent in this case. It's just the parent is providing this option to the child component. And so in this way, it's a delegation or an inversion of the logic. And that's why we call this inversion, because instead of the parent dictating what the child should do, the child now has control over the process. In the next lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about why scoped slots are like this and why they kind of work in an upside down way. So that concludes my talk for today. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned something from it that you can take away and apply to your job, to your work. If you are interested in learning more about the reusable components course that this material was based on, you can head over to my website. There will be a link somewhere that you can find, and you can follow it to check out more about the course. It's aimed more at intermediate to advanced Vue developers. My goal with this course was really to give you as many of those aha moments as possible, to give you more tools, more ways of thinking about your components that would unlock different solutions and different ways of looking at your code. Because when you have more tools available to you, you can get the job done faster and better. And because this is still the launch week for the course, there is still a launch sale going on. So if you are at all interested in the course, be sure to head over there and check it out. Again, I want to thank you for being here to watch me give this presentation, even though it's a little bit weird that I have to record this ahead of time instead of presenting it to you all in person. And I also want to, again, thank everyone involved with putting on this conference. I know it's an enormous amount of work, and so we are all very grateful to be able to be a part of this. Thank you.